The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
April is Parkinson's Awareness Month, and so we revisit our conversation with Dr. Lorraine Kalia from the University Health Network about escalating rates of this insidious disease. Then, Jeyan Jeganathan visits cottage country to see how road salt is affecting Ontario's waterways and how citizen scientists are fighting back. Up first, Nam Kiwanuka speaks to novelist Claire Cameron about her new book, How to Survive a Bear Attack. That's all ahead on the agenda.
Novelist Claire Cameron investigates the shocking true story of a couple killed by a black bear in Ontario's Algonquin Provincial Park in her debut memoir, How to Survive a Bear Attack. Why did this tragedy resonate with her, and what answers does she hope to find in her quest? Clare Cameron joins us now for more. Hi.
Hi.
My goodness, you can write.
Thank you.
This book is so incredibly beautiful. It's so personal, but it's also, it's kind of a guide for something that people might not understand. And just for the record, you were not attacked by a bear.
I was not attacked by a bear.
What happened in your life to prompt you to write this memoir?
I have always been an outdoors person. I love Algonquin Park specifically, about 3 hours north of Toronto. And I've spent my whole life in the wilderness. My father died when I was young. He was diagnosed with cancer, melanoma. And the way I recovered was going out to Algonquin Park specifically and learning to canoe and that sort of thing. And then when I turned 45, I was also diagnosed with cancer, the same kind of cancer. And it's skin cancer, and I have a mutation, which means that I can't go in the sun. So the way I recovered from my father's death and that I'd learned to cope with hard things in life was gone, and I was at such a loss. And it was during that time when I was sort of unclear what to do and not sure about my fate or how long I'd live that I got obsessed with this bear attack again.
And you described that ability to be able to go outside as a loss. I want to come back to that in a moment.
Okay.
But when you get this news, you're 45 years old. Your dad got his diagnosis when he was, I believe, 42.
42,
And
yeah.
you were 9 years old?
Yes.
Very young.
Yes.
And then you had to relay this news to your children.
Yeah.
Knowing how you felt and the things that you processed as a child, and now being a mother
Yeah.
and having to relay that same information to your children, how did you navigate that?
It was so hard. I think especially when I first got the diagnosis. My dad died of cancer in the 80s, so it was a really hard, and it was skin cancer, but it metastasized. And he had chemotherapy, which at that time was sort of like a flamethrower. And he was 6'5". He went down to about 100 pounds when he died. So it was this difficult death that I had such a vivid memory of, and all I could think was that was my fate as well. In some ways, I've never felt closer to my father because we were genetically intertwined. On the other hand, it was just horrific to think not only that my life might be a lot shorter than I imagined, but that the end might be hard and that my kids would have to watch what I had.
I wanted to read a passage from the novel, if I could. You write, I had learned to cope with difficult things in a certain way. My ability to weather the elements in the wilderness, which by its very nature includes sun exposure, had helped me find strength, courage, and perspective. My first instinct after learning I had cancer was to get in a canoe and paddle away. Now the way I'd learned to heal was the one thing I could no longer safely do. Everyone deals with grief in a different way. From your story, as you just said, that the way you found solace and also how you dealt with the grief of your father dying was by going outdoors. Yet, with your diagnosis, you can't do this anymore. How did you process that loss? How did you approach that loss?
I think I have this vivid memory of being in my chair in my office. And one of the novels I wrote is called The Bear, and it was sort of loosely based on this bear attack. It was more like a sort of hallucination of it than based on fact. And I was looking at that novel, and I had this little detail in it, and it said, in the prologue, it said there was an oar found at the front of the campsite, a broken oar. And that struck me because I had a memory from way back when this attack happened that it was a broken paddle. And that just spurred something. I thought, after, I couldn't go outdoors and I didn't know how to cope. And so I just thought, well, the only thing I know how to do is write, and I got this detail wrong, and it just started driving me crazy. And I found myself on the internet trying to find the police officer that had responded to that he was in the search party during this attack, and I called him up and I said, can I come and talk to you, because I need to figure out if this is if it was a paddle or an oar found at the campsite.
And that's important, because some people might think, what is the difference? But there's a big difference.
There is. I mean, this book is in a way written as an investigation, and that is a big clue. An oar is much more sturdy, and it's heavier, and it takes a lot more force to split an oar than it does a paddle. So it said something about the strength of the confrontation that happened at that campsite, but I didn't know what. So I set out not only to find out what happened, but I wanted to find out why. I wanted to know how terror can rip through such a beautiful place that I love.
There's this beautiful passage when you are stuck in your house and you are trying to write, but you can't write. And then you were talking about being in a brick home and being sheltered from the elements, and I guess this idea that we think that we are in control of so much, but yet we're not. Was this a way for you maybe to be in control of something, anything?
I think I didn't know that at the time. In retrospect, I wanted to go north. I had this impulse to go to Algonquin Park because that's where I'd healed before. And I just sort of let this slightly obsessive, perhaps we can put it more nicely as curiosity now, guide me. And, and I went north, but I couldn't go outside. So I did the second best thing, which was talk to all the people that do go outside all the time up there.
Not a lot of people might know what happened in Algonquin Park in 1991. Can you give us the general details of what happened?
Yes, so I was working at a summer camp before or after. So at the time I heard them almost like a ghost story. But a couple on Canadian Thanksgiving went on a camping trip. They left from the Opiongo store and they were going for the long weekend. They didn't turn up on the Tuesday, and their friends and family called the park office. And eventually a search party was set out to an island in the middle of Lake Opiongo, and their remains were found. And so it was a bear attack and a predatory bear attack, which is extremely unusual, especially that 2 adults were killed.
We have a map here of Algonquin Park. It's not very far from the GTA, close to the border of Quebec. It's about a 3-hour drive from Toronto.
Yeah, depending on the traffic.
Right, depending on the traffic, right? It takes an hour to get to Toronto, right? It's 250 kilometers north of Toronto and about 260 kilometers west of Ottawa. You worked in Algonquin Park, as you mentioned, and you led canoe trips there. Do you remember hearing about the bear attack back then?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. So it was on the cover of the Globe and Mail a couple days after it happened, but the details were very sparse. I think as a journalist, you can probably appreciate that it's quite hard to report on a bear attack, and the experts often don't know what's happened. So there's very sparse details. And then the next summer I went back to work in Algonquin Park, and I heard the strangest details, almost like ghost stories around the campfire. Everyone knew a little thing. What? So like the paddle was one, that's how I heard it, that there was a broken paddle when the search party pulled up. And I thought, why is it broken? But I also heard that there was a tray of ground beef found there was rocks around a campfire, and there was a tray of ground beef that was just sitting there. It was 5 days after the couple had arrived at the island, but it was untouched. And I thought it was untouched. There's something significant about that.
Because I think some people might hear that and be like,
So the bear was on the island when the search party came, but he didn't touch the ground beef. He was after the bigger prize. This was a predatory attack.
You've been honest about your, should I say obsession?
Yes. Oh, it's fine. I mean, I think it qualifies.
Yeah. About researching this attack, you mentioned the first book, The Bear, which was a work of fiction.
Yeah.
What do you think drew you to this case?
I love bears. And I have experienced tree planting in the north around Hearst, Ontario. I lived with bears there. I've seen them I've had such peaceful encounters. Black bears are shy. They're smaller than grizzlies. They're more like, and I've thought of them through much of my life, like overgrown raccoons. If they come close, and they generally don't, they get into the garbage or they're attracted by food, and it's my mistake. So I knew that. I had these very peaceful encounters with bears, but then I also knew this had happened. And it was like the more experience I had with the bears and the more research I did and realized how uncommon this was, it was a big gap opened up between the two. And on this one hand, there was this sort of monstrous act. On another, the animals I knew. So I think that in between there.
You did a lot of research on this. You actually went to the site several times where the attack happened, and you even slept there. What was it like the first time that you went?
My husband, the first time?
Yeah.
The first time was with a man named Jeyan Jeganathan, who was in the party, the search party. He worked at the Opeongo store at the time. And he took me over in a boat. And it was amazing because it was 1991 when it happened. And we were there, 2019. But when he talked about it, the blood still moved in his chest. And it was, you could really see it, the memory of it in his eyes. And he also was in a very similar state to me in trying to understand the attack because he'd had as well a lot of experience with black bears that were nothing like this, very ordinary experiences.
And then you have this crazy idea to sleep there, and your husband says what?
So my husband's from California. He's seen a few black bears, but he's not as versed in the Canadian wilderness, and he was unsure about the whole idea. But I really wanted to go to, it turned out to be so important. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. But when we were paddling up to the island, there was this, a naturalist at the time in 1991, the park naturalist said, the couple, this was not their faults. They did nothing wrong. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I knew that was true on a level. But as we were paddling up, I turned around and I could see the sun coming down, and it was at the perfect angle to the island. And I realized they'd chosen this campsite probably in my imagination, but there's a good chance they were outdoors people in order to see the sunset. And I never would have known that unless I'd been there at the Thanksgiving weekend on the same time. And it just gave me this kind of solace, like maybe they were exactly where they wanted to be.
It gave you peace.
Yeah, and peace for their memory in a way, which, going back and revisiting these stories, in a way you're dredging them up. In a way the stories are about offering peace and and finding some solace in the here and now.
You met with a bear biologist by the name of Jeremy Inglis to understand more about the bear and the attack itself.
Yeah.
And he was very nervous about the portrayal of the bear in the story, and at one point asked whether the bear would be treated like a demon. Did that surprise you?
No, because I've studied bears for long enough, and he wasn't going to grant me an interview initially, and he said that exactly. Will this bear be a demon? And it was a question. It took me a few years to answer, actually, because I had this couple who I didn't assign responsibility or wrongdoing, but then this terrible thing happened. So what's on the other side of that? Is that the bad guy? It took me a couple years to understand this attack from the bear's perspective. And quite a bit of the book is telling the story of the bear and the year leading up to the attack.
Why did you, it was a very intentional choice by you to do that.
Yeah.
Bear attacks are very rare. Why did you choose that approach?
Because I think a lot of people kept saying you'll never understand this attack. And I thought, well, there was one point at which I found in the archives below the visitor center in Algonquin Park, there was this binder, and someone had saved a picture of the bear in a local newspaper, and he was lying on his side. He looked very healthy, and he was about 8.5. He was an extremely successful, he wasn't sick. He didn't do this from a position of weakness. And this picture just, he was shot after the attack. He just looked so full of life. I almost felt like I could have put my hands on him and felt heat. And it made me realize this bear had a life, and he made a decision. And I couldn't solve the case. I couldn't figure out why this happened. But when I made the bear the center of the story, and I made it about him, not the people, that's when it started to make sense. That's when I started to understand why this happened.
And he was shot for a reason because he had the taste of...
Yeah, I think if a bear has, I mean, if a bear gets too habituated to humans or is aggressive with humans, they get shot.
Who was Laura Darby?
Laura Darby. So I was trying to, the couple, when they left the dock on the Friday night, no one saw them after that. There were clues left behind on the campsite and footprints and things to sort of piece it together. But we don't actually know what the couple's experience was. So in order to sort of fill in the gaps, I talked to other people who'd had similar. Laura Darby, the bravest woman I've ever met, was working up north, and she was attacked by a black bear in a similar predatory attack, and was very generous in sharing her experience.
And she lived to tell the tale.
She lived to tell the tale. Yeah, she did. She actually, we spent hours, on Zoom, and she talked me all through that and her recovery too. One of the things that really stands out to me about our conversation, she had some dark something behind her when we were on the computers, and I asked her what it was, and she zoomed out and showed me, and it was the pelt of the bear that had attacked her. So she has it on her wall as kind of a reminder, and she lives with it. It's something she lives with, but that she's very much recovered from as well. She's an inspiration.
Yeah, and she went through a lot of trauma, because even just a little sound can make her afraid.
Yeah, especially initially, she said. And she was very purposeful in trying to get herself out into the world. And it was something, I mean, we have very different experiences, but after my operations from cancer and that sort of thing, I related to a lot of how she talked about trying to rejoin the world in a different shape than you were before. I mean, just being scarred, and that you can't see, my scars won't show on TV, but they're on my back and things, and just the feeling of vulnerability. I had always thought throughout my life, because I knew about bears, I had this secret thinking that if a bear came after me, I'd be okay. And then when I got cancer, I was also unsure that I would, have the mental fortitude or the physical. And we both had that, the feeling of being very capable, and then something happens to you that you can't control, and it sort of takes away your agency. How do you get that back?
Yeah, because you did describe your scar as a bite mark.
Yeah.
What did you learn about yourself during this?
So much. I guess at first, and I think so many people are living with cancer. I mean, a good thing is that people are living longer. Cancer used to be a death sentence. It isn't so much now, but you have to learn to live with the fear that it can come back. And so I've learned to be much more in the moment and, value everyday life and project ahead less than I used to.
And you're a runner.
Yeah.
Now you've had to rearrange. Running used to be your warm-up.
Yeah, exactly.
And now it's the main event,
it's the main thing.
And you structure your day according to the sun.
I'm almost like a sundial. So I go about 2 hours before the sun goes down, and then that switches through the year. So, when it's the darkest day in November, I'll go at like 2:30 in the afternoon. But then when it's really sunny in June, I'll go late at night.
Because you said it, this has taught you to live in the moment. If you're planning your day according to the possibility this cancer might come back, how does that impact you on a day-to-day?
I used to, I used to go north to seek the wilderness and to seek the solace of that. And what this has really taught me is that the wilderness is everywhere. So now I live in Toronto. I run down by the Lake Ontario. So, this huge body of water that I've somehow ignored for much of my life living here. It's a beautiful place. It's the most wild place I know. And I go there and I feel like I'm in the wilderness. And I've realized there's wilderness behind my house in the alley. There's wilderness in the cracks of the sidewalk. This has really taught me to not think of, the wilderness isn't just contained in Algonquin Park. It's everywhere.
I wanted to read another passage from your book. You write, "The same cells that helped me paddle and kept me alive were also the ones that might kill me. Terror, if I wanted to pinpoint it, already lived inside me. And so does the beauty of Algonquin Park. Terror and beauty can't be pulled apart. They can't be separated, no matter how tempting it might be to try." What did you mean when you wrote terror and beauty can't be pulled apart?
I think, this idea, this slightly ridiculous idea that I was alluding to before, that I was ready for a bear attack at any moment. I expected danger to come from the outside. And when I was diagnosed with cancer, I realized that it's in my cells and it's me, it's part of me. And I inherited, I like to think, my dad's sense of humor and his blue eyes, and my son's tall like him. And I also inherited this mutation. And the idea that it's wild inside me as well is a comfort, because cancer isn't something I'm fighting. It's not a dark shape coming for me. It's very much who I am.
But that also means it's inside you. It's also in your children.
Mm-hmm. Possibly, yeah. They haven't been tested yet. But yes, it's an inherited trait.
How do you reconcile that?
I don't know that I have quite yet. My oldest is 19, so he's making his own decisions. But it is something we just try and talk about and be present with in our family. And that's another thing, that you can get paralyzed by fear, or you can lead with love and connection. And so that's what we're always trying to do.
I love that, lead with love and connection. When you were diagnosed, you wrote that you lost your voice. You felt like you lost your voice. How has this investigation and process helped you find it? Has it helped you find it?
Absolutely. I think there's a bit of fiction in the book, and I was sort of stuck. So I couldn't go into the wilderness. I just have my picture of myself stuck in the blue chair, and just this obsessive curiosity I had about figuring out the details of what happened in this attack. I met people like Dave Stott, who's a retired police officer with the Ontario Provincial Police, who was incredibly generous, had me to his home. He was a first responder. I made friends with him and his wife. Or the bear biologist, Jeremy Inglis, I keep in touch with, and I'll go up and he has trail cams and all that sort of thing. I just started to turn outward. I think being diagnosed with cancer, I got very internal, and this investigation helped me turn outward again and so I know I wasn't on a 30-day canoe trip, but I was spending my days on the shadier trails of the park, and I was talking to people who were passionate about bears, or law enforcement, or who'd been through an incredible experience. And this is about the connection. It's about connecting with people and spending your day with something you're interested in. It's that simple, I think.
And I really appreciated how you told the story of the couple, because you humanized them. Because I think oftentimes when we hear awful things happen on the news, the people's names might be mentioned, but you spoke to their families, you painted a picture of who these people were, and I thought that was so lovely. This book felt like a book about the human experience of processing fear, things we can't control, grief, and the unknown. What message do you hope that readers take away from your story?
I hope it's a story about connection and about love. That those are the two things that matter, and everything else needs to be organized around those. And it's amazing if you let those two things lead, the resilience. I think in the book I describe it as, we're all born and we're all going to die, and in between there's a bridge, and that is love. And that's what you have to wake up and focus on every day.
And we get to decide how we live that.
Exactly.
How are you doing now?
Good. I've had, sort of good. My genetics aren't great, I guess. So I've had cancer since the initial diagnosis, on my leg and in my eye too. So it's something I've lived with. For a long time I was waiting to get over it, but that's not the case for me. I'm going to be always having it.
And in the book you describe what the operation was like when you had it in the eye.
Oh my gosh.
You are such a bad, fill in the blank. You are such a rad person. The way you described, you were watching and the things that you've navigated. You're such a beautiful writer.
Thank you.
And something that you actually do learn from the book too also is you do learn how to survive a bear attack.
You do. There's a practical, so I'm not just being arty with this title. And part of that is because people know I know about bears, and they're always saying, well, what do I do if a bear comes into my camp? Or so I really wanted this book to have a practical element, because it's actually quite a complicated answer, and it takes a length of a book to answer. So I hope people come, because the big danger to bears there isn't much. There's one bear attack like this a year at most in North America, and not like this because 2 people were killed in this one. Statistically, we kill bears in the thousands. That's, and if we need to learn to live alongside bears. And the way to do that is to learn how to coexist and treat them well and keep our campsite clean and stuff like that. So there's lots of that kind of thing in the book as well.
Claire, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Fantastic book. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay.
The escalating rates of Parkinson's disease, both globally and here in Canada, have led some researchers to warn that it is becoming a pandemic. To help shed light on a disease that still has no cure, we welcome Dr. Lorraine Cameron. She is a neurologist and senior scientist at the University Health Network's Krimble Brain Institute. She's also an associate professor at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicine, and we are happy to have you here on our program tonight. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Let's just, before we get you to answer some Q&A here, Sheldon, would you bring this graphic up and we'll do some of the 411 for background here. According to Parkinson Canada, this disease is the fastest growing neurological disease in the world. By the year 2040, the global prevalence of Parkinson's is expected to double from 6 million to 12 million. Its prevalence in Canada has increased nearly 50% over the past 10 years. More than 100,000 Canadians live with Parkinson's and 30 more are diagnosed every day. But by 2031, which is not that far away, that number is expected to rise to more than 50 people a day, almost double where we are today. All right, let's learn more about this. What is Parkinson's disease?
So first off, it's a disease that we need to know about for all of the reasons that you explained. The simple answer is it's a neurological condition that's really a brain disease that we categorize as a neurodegenerative disorder, meaning that brain cells die faster than normal. All of our brain cells are dying in adulthood, but in Parkinson's disease, a certain population of brain cells die faster for reasons we don't entirely understand. And as a consequence, people can have a myriad of symptoms: movement abnormalities, cognitive difficulties, constipation, mood difficulties. And so it's a disease that is progressive and, as you already mentioned, something that we don't have a cure for yet.
Are you born with it, or do you pick it up some way later in life?
And so that's a great question in terms of why do some people get it and some people don't. We know that there's a small proportion of people who have a very clear genetic cause, and so they will carry that genetic abnormality from birth, but for some reason not actually manifest the disease until adulthood. But the majority of people probably develop the disease for a combination of different reasons that include environmental exposures, a combination of genetics, and in some cases, just overall kind of a bad luck of a combination of things. So in most cases, when people come to the clinic and get diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, their first question is, why me? And really at this point in time, for the vast majority of people, we don't have a really good answer as to why.
What role does dopamine play in all of this?
Yeah, so dopamine is central to this condition. Those brain cells that have a tendency to die faster than normal, they are brain cells that make the chemical dopamine. And we all have dopamine in our brain. We all need it for a variety of things. But because these brain cells die faster, there's then less dopamine in the brain. And as a consequence, the symptoms that people have with Parkinson's are as a consequence of primarily dopamine deficiency or a lack of dopamine in the brain.
Apparently, if you're on TikTok a lot, you get a hit of dopamine. Is one of the cures to Parkinson's potentially just spend a lot of time on TikTok?
Definitely not.
It's a bit of a facetious question.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
To your point, though, things that can kind of boost dopamine are not necessarily a cure for Parkinson's, but can be helpful. So exercise would be one example. So there's probably a variety of reasons why exercise is beneficial for people with Parkinson's disease, but one of the consequences of exercising is a release of dopamine, and many people who have Parkinson's and exercise will clearly tell you how much better they feel after they exercise, as we all feel better when we exercise, and in part that's probably because of this extra dopamine release.
Who was this guy Parkinson anyway?
Yeah, so I mean, he was a physician from the early 1800s. He described this disease in 1817 with an essay on what he called the shaking palsy. He was a bit of a Renaissance man, as I think most physicians were at that time, a chemist and a geologist. But he had observed 3 people in his clinical practice, 3 people on the streets of London, not his own patients. And from what he observed of these 6 different patients, put together basically a constellation of observations that he then described as this disease. It was the a preeminent neurologist in the 1900s, Charcot, who decided that this disease should be named after him because he was the first person who really described it clearly in a clinical context, although we know from ancient writings Indians and in China, these descriptions were actually made back in 1000 BC.
Right, so this goes way back, but
yeah.
James Parkinson was the guy who got his name put on it.
Yes, and he laid it out very clearly. And there's many observations that we all find quite fascinating that he made just from looking at people that have held true in terms of what the disease is till today.
If you had a parent who died of Parkinson's, how likely are you to get it?
That's a great question, and often a question that people ask because a lot of people will have family members who have Parkinson's disease. The straight answer, if we don't look at specific genetic testing, is you probably have a 3 times chance of what people who don't have a family member. And if we kind of use numbers, so if you're 60 or older, you have a 1% chance of getting Parkinson's disease. So 3 times might seem like a lot, but ultimately it's 3% chance, so it's still a far minority. But going back to the genetics question, we do know now that about 10% of people will have an identifiable gene that causes their Parkinson's disease. And in some cases, we can actually test for that gene. And, some of the optimism that we have in the field is that there are treatments that are in development for people who have genetic forms of disease. And we wonder whether or not it may be there where we have the first breakthroughs for treatments that actually can prevent the progression of the disease.
True or false? Most people who get this are over age 60.
So the answer to that is true, but I just want to emphasize that it's not only people over age 60. So the majority of people, for sure, age 60 and over, are the people who get Parkinson's. And we know that the risk for Parkinson's increases with age. So you have a higher risk of getting Parkinson's when you're 80 versus when you're 60. But I think this is Parkinson's Awareness Month. And I think one important thing to make people aware of, in addition to everything that we're talking about, is that Parkinson's disease is not only a disease of people who are 60 and older. Many people in their 50s, in their 40s will actually develop Parkinson's disease. It will look different, but obviously it has huge impacts on people at that age. They're starting, they have families, they're in the middle of jobs, and their needs might be different than people who are 80, and we have to kind of be aware of that and make sure that we approach, the needs of those patients in an appropriate way.
What's the youngest person you've seen or treated who has Parkinson's?
The youngest person that I've treated is in their 30s, but I do know my colleagues at the Hospital for Sick Children do see rarely there's patients who can manifest disease in their teens. If
you get it when you're younger and therefore presumably more vigorous,
Yep.
Are you able to, fight it off better?
Yeah, so it's interesting because in general, the earlier you develop the disease, it appears that the progression of your disease is slower. So it seems a little bit counterintuitive because you think of somebody developing a disease early and that means that they're going to have years and years of this disease and things are obviously progressing, but actually the rate of progression is slower the earlier you get it compared to the later you get it. And we don't understand that at all, but compensatory mechanisms, I think, and some resilience that you have at a younger age may be reasons why that would be the case.
How difficult is it to diagnose?
In some cases, it's very straightforward. I don't advise this, but I have some patients who come to me when they saw their first neurologist and they're told, I could tell from the waiting room that you had Parkinson's disease. That's not the way to diagnose Parkinson's disease, although one could argue that's the way that James Parkinson's diagnosed Parkinson's disease with patients that he saw on the street. But it requires a combination of things. Basically, what I see in the clinic, so what the actual physical findings are on examination, what the patient tells me in terms of the way things have progressed for them over the past couple of months to years, and then also looking for features that tell me it's not Parkinson's disease. often I talk about there, and many of us talk about there being a test of time, because really what helps us making a more definitive diagnosis is how the disease progresses and how it responds to medications. But right now, today, we don't have a blood test or a brain scan that we're able to do and then definitively say, yes, you have Parkinson's disease, or no, you don't have Parkinson's disease. And so one of the major unmet needs in Parkinson's disease research is having a clear diagnostic test.
In the same way that Alzheimer's is a particular type of dementia, is Parkinson's a particular type of, I don't know what, something else?
Well, they're both neurodegenerative diseases. And so the parts of the brain where brain cells die faster in Alzheimer's are different than in Parkinson's, which is why they look different. But again, I think an important kind of awareness piece is we often think of Alzheimer's disease and dementia and Parkinson's disease and movement problems. But in fact, Parkinson's disease can very much be associated with cognitive impairment, and that might be mild early in the disease. But for many patients, studies have shown that 10 years into this disease, approximately 80% of people will actually have dementia. And I think that sometimes can come to a surprise for people who have family members with Parkinson's disease, because that's not what they kind of anticipated as what the disease is going to look like, but an important component for many people to deal with.
We have made so many great strides in finding the whys behind some of these diseases, the cure for some of these diseases, progress we've made in cancer and so on.
Right.
COVID vaccination, pretty quick, etc. Parkinson seems to be particularly stubborn and doesn't want to let us in.
Yes.
Why is that?
For a number of reasons. One, I think the brain is complicated. I would argue it's the most complicated organ we have. I can, have debates with my cardiology colleagues and my hepatology colleagues, but I think the brain is a complicated structure. Complicated the way it works, complicated the way that neurons function. And so just understanding of the disease has been a challenge. I do think over the past 2 decades, we have actually made significant strides in understanding why these brain cells die. And when you understand the why, then you can start to address that with potential therapies. And so I think we're on the cusp of that place where now we really understand the culprits in Parkinson's disease and can try and target them. Other aspects and practical aspects, to understand a disease, you obviously have to do research, and research is fueled not just by people motivated to do research and people who are talented and motivated to understand the disease, but practical things like funding. And Parkinson's disease, I'd say, has been underfunded in comparison to other conditions, in part because I don't think there's a lot of awareness in terms of what the needs are. And I think earlier on, many people weren't really touched by Parkinson's disease, so it seemed like a kind of quiet disease, a silent disease that maybe didn't really need to be addressed. But I think there is some appreciation now with this concept of a potential pandemic of Parkinson's disease, with the huge escalation of number of cases, that it is really going to be a significant public health issue that could potentially be thwarted by a cure or something that could stop the progression of the disease, because then we could actually prevent people's progression and worsening of the condition.
Yeah, I hate to put it this way, but people who are in the fundraising business talk about it this way. There are other diseases that are quote unquote sexier and easier to raise money for. Right. And Parkinson's has never been one of those. Right. Is that part of your problem here?
Yeah, I mean, yes, for sure. I think so. And I think one demonstration of how important funding has been been an example of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, which has been able to fund a huge amount of research. And that, I think, has been one of the important aspects, not the only one, but obviously a very important aspect to the progress that we've been able to make over the past couple of decades.
A blood test. How close are you to that game changer?
So I think the field is close. I think obviously Alzheimer's disease is closer to having a blood test that they're going to be able to use. People often talk about us being a little bit behind Alzheimer's disease, which we typically are, again, probably due to the amount of research that's going into the area. But there are tests right now that look quite promising, where you take either a piece of skin or some spinal fluid that may be quite useful for diagnostics. We appreciate that that's not going to be the most practical approach, and there is initial work, interesting research that's looking like we can probably tweak that test to be able to do a similar test out of blood. And so I think it's going to be, within the next several years, I do think it's going to be a game changer in terms of us being able to diagnose the disease more definitively. And I think where people are very, very excited, and this won't have implications for people who have Parkinson's today and now, but that we may be able to diagnose the disease very, very early, even before I would make a diagnosis in clinic. And so then it opens up the possibility of prevention.
One of the things we did see during COVID is that research facilities and research teams all over the world worked together in an unprecedented fashion, and they made a hell of a lot of progress pretty quickly.
Yep.
Is any of that happening with Parkinson's?
It is, and I think it's super important. I mean, back in the day, people would work in silos, and each individual researcher could make some progress, but the actual scientific fields, the technologies, each person's expertise is so individualized and specialized now that for us to really be able to make progress, we have to work together. There's no doubt about it. And so there is more and more, not just work along collaborations within, institutions or across countries, but more there is global collaboration. And I think this is clearly going to be key for us to make more progress.
Well, we thank you for helping us understand this much better.
Thanks for having me.
That's Dr. Lorraine Calia, neurologist, senior scientist, University Health Network's Krembil Brain Institute. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
As the snow melts and the earth wakes up, winter starts to let go. Spring is here, finally. Runoff flows into rivers and lakes, but these waters that we welcome carry something we can't see. Road salt, chemically known as sodium chloride. It works by lowering the freezing point of water, making it harder for ice to form. And this past winter, a winter full of storms, ice was an issue for communities across Ontario.
A winter storm warning is in effect, stretching from Windsor to Montreal.
A brutal ice storm left hundreds of thousands of Ontarians in the dark.
Up in Muskoka, the same system is bringing even more snow to an area.
And it's in Muskoka where environmentalists are sounding the alarm bells on road salt.
Well, right now we're coming down to Muskoka Bay, Gravenhurst Bay, and there's a creek running into the bay here that I've been sampling for the last 2.5 years.
Neil Hutchinson has dedicated his life to water quality. After working as an aquatic scientist across Canada, he's now retired and part of the Friends of the Muskoka Watershed, a group focused on identifying and addressing threats to Muskoka's waterways.
5 or 6 years ago, we became quite aware of the problem of road salt and the chloride ion, which is the toxic component of road salt, in our runoff off our roads into our very soft waters.
Many Ontarians are familiar with images like this. These photos were captured by the Friends of the Muskoka Watershed. They highlight the excessive amount of road salt used over the winter.
Oh, there's a mess. That's going to end up in the river.
Yeah, I wonder how much salt's in that. Holy moly.
The documentation is part of a study Neil and a team of citizen scientists have been conducting to see how much of this road salt is draining into Muskoka's watershed.
What we do is collect a very small quantity of water, starting when the melt starts, which is right now. We get access to the snow and salt, which is coming off of the sidewalks, coming out of the parking lots, coming off of the roads.
Ultimately, we want to know the concentration of chloride. Chloride is toxic. It's declared toxic, as is road salt, but we measure it quite simply with a little pen that you can stick in the water, and it immediately reads the conductivity.
So here's the conductivity meter. That's very, very high. 730. It's still going up, considerably higher than we have in the lake.
Conductivity is the ability of the water to carry an electrical current, and the more ions that are dissolved in the water, the higher the conductivity, the better able it is to conduct electricity, such that distilled water would have no conductivity, whereas seawater has something like 50,000 units of conductivity.
This whole area of the neighborhood has 5 different drainage areas that come down, and they all go right into Gull Lake, so there's no filtration or anything.
Over the course of 2 years, citizen scientists like Sandy Cairns and Joanne Smith have conducted over 600 measurements at 27 sites in Gravenhurst, Bracebridge, and Huntsville. They tested drains and creeks year-round that flow into large bodies of water like Lake Muskoka, Gull Lake, and Jevons Lake. According to the data, the worst salt concentrations came from 4 storm drains in Bracebridge. The findings only confirmed what Neil and his team already knew. Salt is silently saturating Muskoka's waters. The Friends of the Muskoka watershed estimate that Lake Muskoka now holds around 30,000 tons of road salt. And it's not just in cottage country. Many Toronto area streams are getting saltier. Across Ontario, about 2.2 million tons of road salt are spread on public roads every year.
In 2001, Environment Canada declared road salt to be a hazardous substance, and that required the government to set water quality objectives for it and to start paying attention to how it's managed. Gravenhurst Bay has increased by about 30 or 35-fold in chloride concentrations over the last 50 years. And that's a direct result of runoff from our activities of spreading road salt around in the watershed.
The Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment has set guidelines for how much salt freshwater ecosystems can handle before it starts harming aquatic life. But those guidelines might not work everywhere.
The guidelines, which were actually determined near Toronto back in the early 2000s, came in at a level of 120 milligrams per liter. But we are far more sensitive up here because we have a different kind of bedrock, which is granite. And it's very different from the bedrock which is down near Toronto, which is limestone. And the limestone breaks down, so it's kind of buffering the solution. Whereas up here in Muskoka, we've got the granite, which is rather inert. So the zooplankton are the ones which are very, very fragile, and we're finding that they are dying at a much faster pace than they are down in the GTA, where we've got the hard water.
The Friends of the Muskoka watershed have gained a new tool in their efforts to combat excessive road salt use.
Hi.
Hey.
How are you doing?
Hi, I'm Alicia.
I'm Bart.
Alicia Breckenridge is the project lead for the Salty Muskoka project.
We're starting a new program to help everybody in Muskoka reduce their excess.
Thanks to a federal grant from the Canadian Water Agency, they now have boots on the ground. It's estimated that about 20% of road salt used in Muskoka is applied in parking lots, driveways, and sidewalks.
I'll be able to work with the community in reducing the salt use in those sites. So that means talking to people that live here, talking to small businesses, and having those conversations with winter maintenance contractors and also with store owners that can actually bring in some alternatives and collectively just raise the awareness of reducing salt in our community.
One of the biggest messages she's trying to spread about road salt is that a little goes a long way.
This cup holds 12 ounces of road salt, but I'm just using sand just to demonstrate that this cup will cover this entire space.
Road salt is a popular choice because it's cheap and it works. Research has shown its use can significantly reduce winter-related car crashes, but it has its limitations.
I think we assume that it's going to work in all temperatures, and it actually doesn't. So road salt, the effectiveness starts to wear off after like minus 10, minus 12. Road salt doesn't work on ice anymore. So you have to look at maybe using sand as traction instead.
It can cause skin irritation for our furry friends and is highly corrosive to buildings.
I heard just the other day was somebody said our sliding doors are so rusty and it's causing, and they're putting it down to road salt, and it is. It's actually a corrosive, and so it's damaging a lot of infrastructure around buildings.
In 2012, 2 people died and many more were injured when the rooftop parking deck of the Algo Center Mall in Elliott Lake caved in. Corrosion caused by years of water and road salt was considered one of the contributing factors. A forensic study found the rusted steel supports looked like they had spent decades in seawater. The Friends of the Muskoka watershed did get a win earlier this year. The District of Muskoka passed a resolution to safely reduce its road salt use and push the province to establish a committee to advise cities and towns on how best to protect freshwater ecosystems from salt. But changing policy is just one part of the puzzle. Liability is another major challenge.
If I slip and break my hip, then I might sue the store owner, who will then have to sue his maintenance person because I slipped because not enough salt was applied. Well, there are several jurisdictions, some in the United States, that have got a program where these applicators certify themselves as smart about salt. So if they can demonstrate that they've taken the course and have not overapplied the salt, then they are immune from prosecution for liability. So we'd like to work with other groups and get the government to have a look at the liability clauses and how we might make sure it's done properly and still insulate people from claims.
According to the Friends of the Muskoka watershed, the path to reducing road salt use and protecting the freshwater ecosystem so vital to Muskoka and the rest of Canada is clear. It starts with stronger policies, better training, and raising awareness.
So I'm going to leave you this. I often get overwhelmed by the amount of environmental issues that face us today. But road salt is one issue that is easily remedied, and we can reduce our use.
We could take action to get rid of pollutants and be effective and maintain the beautiful world around us. So to me, it's a matter of the land that we live in, our obligation not to harm it, to tread lightly, and to enjoy it for all that it offers.
This time on Ontario Chronicle, I want to tell you a story that involves some chicanery, some strategic backstabbing, and maybe just a little bit of anti-Semitism, which resulted in the end of the 42-year-long Tory dynasty in Ontario. I want to start by taking you back to Thanksgiving 1984. Bill Davis has been Premier of Ontario for more than 13 years, and one of the things that he always did every Thanksgiving was to gather his family at his cottage on Georgian Bay, near Honey Harbor. But this year, Thanksgiving was going to be different. He had everybody assembled at the dining room table, and he said, I kind of have an important announcement I want to share with everybody here. And he shocked everybody by saying, I'm announcing that I'm going to be stepping down as Premier of Ontario. And so the Tories were off to a leadership convention called for January of 1985. 4 contenders decided to line up in order to assume Bill Davis's mantle and become the successor Premier in the province of Ontario. Frank Miller, former Treasurer, former Health Minister, former Industry Minister, on the right-hand side of the PC party, small c Conservative. Larry Grossman, also former Treasurer, former Health Minister, former Industry Minister. Downtown Toronto MPP. Yes, there was a time when Tories won seats in downtown Toronto. Dennis Timbrell, longest-serving health minister in 50 years. Agriculture minister as well. Represented Don Mills in North Toronto. And finally, Roy McMurtry, Midtown Toronto MPP, long-serving Attorney General for the province of Ontario. 4 strong, solid contenders. And Bill Davis said to all of them, remember guys, we're in government now. You can't be out there bad-mouthing each other in order to win this campaign. And it's going to be a nice, civilized convention. Now remember, these are the good old days. What do I mean by that? This was a good old-fashioned delegated convention. Arm twisting in between ballots. You never knew where people were going to go. Candidates who dropped off the ballot had to make important decisions about who to support and who to ignore. Anyway, you had all of that strategic fun happening on the day. Okay, it's Convention Day, January 1985. The delegates vote, the vote is counted, and the first ballot results look like this. Frank Miller in first, Dennis Timbrell in second, Larry Grossman in third, Roy McMurtry in fourth and last. By rule, he drops off. Here's where the strategic backstabbing comes in. The Miller people understood the delegate counts very, very well. And so, for that second ballot, they decided to loan some of their delegate support to Larry Grossman in the hopes that Grossman would pass Timbrell on the second ballot, setting up a Frank Miller, Larry Grossman third ballot. Why did the Miller people want that? Miller well understood that a Miller-Timbrell final ballot might be hard to win. But he thought he would have a better chance of defeating Larry Grossman because Grossman was Jewish. This is 1985. There are still parts of the province of Ontario, particularly in Tory pockets, where having the last name Grossman would not be an asset. We go to the second ballot, and here come the results. Frank Miller in first, Larry Grossman in second. He vaults ahead of Dennis Timbrell, who's now in third, and he has to drop out. What's the difference between second and third? 6 votes. It sets up a third ballot between Frank Miller and Larry Grossman, and Miller wins it by 77 votes. Close. Very close. It always confounded Dennis Timbrell how he somehow went from second to third on the second ballot, despite the fact that he had strong support, but he couldn't put his finger on how it happened until a couple of years after the fact. One day, Dennis Timbrell got a phone call. The person on the phone said, "Dennis, I'm calling to offer you an apology. Remember all those rumors at the convention in January of 1985 surrounding how Larry Grossman went past you on the second ballot? It wasn't a rumor. It actually happened." Timbrell says, "How do you know?" The man on the phone says, "'Cause I was in charge of organizing it for Frank Miller's campaign." Timbrell was livid. Because, of course, Frank Miller won the convention, went on to call an election, lost the election, and the Tory dynasty came to an end. So Timbrell said to the fella on the phone, "Well, I hope you're happy with what you've done to our party and this province," and hung up on him.
Who was the guy?
I know who the guy was who made the phone call.
You gonna tell us?
Well, his name was... I know his daughter. She's a friend of mine. It's always an open question as to ask whether or not, had Dennis Timbrell won that convention, would the Tory dynasty have continued? I'll tell you who definitely believes that the dynasty would have continued had Timbrell won that convention. Dennis R. Timbrell. And that is the agenda for Monday, April 28th, 2025. Hope you voted today. Tomorrow, John Michael McGrath and yours truly will bring you a post-federal election episode of the On Poly podcast with a special focus on what Ontario did to contribute to whomever forms the next government. Hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow for our post-election special edition of On Poly.